Welcome back. So far, we've looked at three major ways in which we can approach the Celts: through the writings of the classical authors who encountered them, through the artifacts that archaeologists dig out of the ground, and through the languages that they spoke. We've seen that the picture we get of the Celts is varied. They're not one monolithic people, and they didn't form a single empire, although a lot of older books will represent them this way. So far, we've mostly talked about the Celts in rather broad terms. We've covered the whole area that has traditionally been associated with the Celts. In this lecture, we'll concentrate on a very specific encounter between the Celts and the classical world, because it was so important that it deserves a whole lecture to itself. I'll be looking at the process by which Rome finally conquered and assimilated the Gaulish territory in both northern Italy and what is now France. And I'll focus particularly on Julius Caesar's famous conquest of Gaul. We'll see that the Celts often got drawn into the larger story of the slow but inexorable growth of Roman power in the Western Mediterranean. In contrast to the raids by the Celts on Italy and Greece that we talked about earlier, Caesar's campaigns in Gaul targeted the homeland of the Celts themselves. The story of why Caesar went into Gaul is fascinating, and it involves quite a bit of political intrigue on both the Roman side and the Gaulish side. In order to tell this story, I'm going to first set the scene by describing the political situation between the Gauls and the Romans leading up to the mid-1st century BC. It turns out that the Romans and the Gauls had a long history of conflict in Italy itself that might have prepared the way for at least some Romans to support his efforts to conquer Gaul. Then I'll talk about how the conquest came about, and finally, I'll describe the aftermath. We have to back up all the way to the mid-3rd century BC. And we need to start not in Gaul, but in northern Italy, which was a Celtic-speaking area. You'll remember that after the clashes between the Gauls and the Romans in the 4th century BC, the Romans had pushed back against the Gauls living in northern Italy, in the Po Valley, a region that they called Cisalpine Gaul, or Gaul this side of the Alps. By the 220s BC, the Romans had thoroughly militarized this region. They had imposed Roman garrisons on the population, and they were planting colonies of Romans among the native Celts, whose most important tribe was called the Boii. But the Boii were not giving up just yet. The Romans had other enemies, and the Boii were open to allying with those enemies. In the spring of 218 BC, an envoy arrived in Cisalpine Gaul from Hannibal, the famous Carthaginian commander, seeking an alliance with the Boii against the Romans. Then Hannibal famously crossed the Alps with a huge army and a few elephants, and he did so with the help of local Gaulish guides. Once he arrived in northern Italy, the Boii rebelled against the Roman garrisons in their midst and joined forces with Hannibal. So that means the Gauls of northern Italy have just thrown in their lot with the most dangerous enemy the Romans had ever faced. And the Boii and their Celtic neighbors were absolutely crucial to Hannibal's success in advancing south toward Rome. The Romans found out about Hannibal's movements and sent an army north to try to stop him. But the army of the Boii was able to delay the Romans long enough for Hannibal to make it safely into the Po Valley. Then the Romans fought 2 battles with Hannibal and lost both of them. In each case, Hannibal benefited from intelligence provided by the local Celtic population. When it was clear that Hannibal was making a go of his invasion, thousands of Celtic warriors joined Hannibal's army, and they were prominent in Hannibal's great victory at Lake Trasimeno, where an entire Roman army was destroyed. Hannibal then headed south, but skirted the city of Rome, which he wrongly believed to be well defended. The Roman commander Varro marched out of the city to meet Hannibal. The battle that followed, the Battle of Cannae, was the largest military disaster in Roman history. Livy tells us that 50,000 Roman troops were killed. Hannibal relied heavily on Celtic cavalry, who drew the Romans into trouble by feigning a retreat. After the battle, the surviving Roman soldiers were forced to go under the yoke, which was a form of ritual humiliation. So Celts from northern Italy were instrumental in bringing about Rome's greatest military disaster. Hannibal eventually lost the war, of course, but the close alliance between the northern Italian Celts and Rome's fiercest opponent did not exactly endear the Celts to the Romans, and Rome spent the next several decades systematically conquering the Celtic territory of northern Italy and Romanizing any of the Celts who were not driven across the Alps. You'll remember that Gaul had been divided into Transalpine Gaul and Cisalpine Gaul, or Gaul across the Alps and Gaul on this side of the Alps. Now, Cisalpine Gaul was nicknamed Gallia Togata, or the Gaul of those who wear the toga. And by the 1st century BC, the former Cisalpine Gaul was just part of Italy. Incidentally, Transalpine Gaul was also renamed. Its new designation was Gallia Comata, or hairy Gaul. This was a reference to the fact that the Gauls wore their hair long and did not shave their beards, unlike the clean-shaven Romans. So in these new names for Gaul, we see that the territory of the Gauls has now been divided into the region in northern Italy where the Gauls had been culturally and politically assimilated to Rome, and the region in what is now France where they had not. But the Celts of Gallia Togata did make one last stand against Rome. They played an important role in the well-known slave revolt led by Spartacus, which was depicted in a famous movie from 1960 starring Kirk Douglas. In 73 BC, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus broke out of captivity in southern Italy and gathered a large army consisting largely of Celts, including his two most important generals. Spartacus moved north in an effort to meet up with the Celts of the Po Valley, but he was eventually cornered and killed, probably in battle. Still, this means that the Celts were associated with two of the Romans' most dangerous opponents, Hannibal and Spartacus. But if Cisalpine Gaul has been thoroughly conquered and Romanized, what about Transalpine Gaul, Gaul beyond the Alps, or hairy Gaul? What is going on there? First, we need to keep in mind the big picture of Rome's strategic priorities. I mentioned earlier that in the late 3rd century BC, Hannibal had traveled up from Spain along the Mediterranean coast to northern Italy and down through Cisalpine Gaul. This land route between Italy and Spain was crucial to the Romans if they wanted to keep in contact with their colonies in Spain. Right in the middle of this land route was the city of Massalia, a Greek colony founded in 600 BC. Massalia would become the modern city of Marseille. Massalia had developed into a crucial trading city with connections both in the Mediterranean and also deep into Celtic territory in Gaul. But the neighborhood of Massalia was rather dangerous. In the middle of the 2nd century BC, Massalia was attacked by a tribe known as the Saliers, which were referred to by Roman soldiers as Celto-Ligurians, which means that the Romans were actually confused about the identity of these people. But at any rate, the threat from the Saliers continued, and so Massalia called on Rome for help. Rome took the opportunity to make a deal with Massalia. Sure, we'll help you against your enemies, but in return, we want to annex your hinterland. Massalia was up against it, so they said yes. And Rome then sought out and defeated some of the Celtic allies of the Saliers to the north of Massalia. Rome thereby acquired an important strip of coastal territory in Gaul that they named simply the Province, which is the origin of the modern French name of the region, Provence. But Celtic Gaul was by no means a stable place. Various Celtic tribes jockeyed for supremacy, and one tribe in particular, the Cimbri, became a threat to Rome around 113 BC. The Cimbri had arrived in Gaul from somewhere in northwestern Europe, possibly from as far north as Jutland in Denmark, though this is highly uncertain. At any rate, they appeared in the Rhone Valley, just north of Massalia, in the territory that the Romans now considered their own backyard, and they began stirring up trouble. The Cimbri allied with other tribes, including the mysterious Teutones, who joined in the war against Rome, and over the course of less than a decade, various Gaulish tribes defeated 4 large Roman armies sent to contain them. By 105 BC, there was nothing between the Gaulish armies and Rome itself, and the people of Rome were panicking. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of heading for Rome, the Cimbri and Teutones turned around and headed west for Iberia, where they plundered for a while before being driven out in turn by the Celt-Iberians. The Romans had really been lucky there, but it would be easy to see why Gaul was considered a threat to the security of the empire. And the threat was not over. In 102 BC, a group of Teutones and another tribe called the Ambrones moved south to threaten the Po Valley. But this time, they had picked the wrong Roman general to go up against. The Roman commander was Gaius Marius, who is most famous today for having reorganized the Roman army into a professional fighting force. Marius drove the Teutones and Ambrones back up into Gaul and caught them near Aix, where he encircled them and slaughtered them. Supposedly, there was so much blood spilled on the battlefield that it brought forth bumper crops of grain for several years thereafter. The following year, Marius won another major victory against the Gauls, and that was the end of the aggressive threat that they posed to the city of Rome. It had been a long, hard slog, though, and the Romans remembered how tough it had been to defeat them. For a few generations after the Roman victories under Marius, there was relative peace in Gaul, but things were still far from stable, because starting in the mid-60s BC, Gaul began to be threatened by new invaders from the north and east, namely various tribes of Germans. As these people began putting pressure on Celtic territory, the inhabitants of Gaul began remilitarizing in response. In particular, the various tribal federations reoccupied the large hill forts that had characterized the area hundreds of years earlier. These fortresses are known to us by the Latin word oppida. The singular is oppidum. An oppidum was basically a glorified hill fort, but these oppida were very strong militarily. Often they were defended by walls of stone or timber and extensive earthworks. You did not just assault one of these without a lot of preparation. Interestingly, the story of the Roman conquest of Gaul, in a sense, demonstrates not that the Celtic tribes were barbaric, but rather that they were not all that different from their neighbors to the south, despite what Caesar might have wanted the readers of his commentaries on the Gallic War to believe. We have to keep in mind that the rulers of these federations were subject to the same political pressures and infighting as any of the other states on the borders of the Roman Empire. The Gauls had to figure out whether it made more sense to fight the Romans or make a deal with them, which was just exactly the calculation that was being made all along the borders of Roman territory. The Gauls were simply outmaneuvered and outfought, just like the Carthaginians and the Greeks and the many other peoples the Romans defeated. But let's get on to Caesar. The story of Julius Caesar and the Gauls used to be familiar to every educated Westerner because almost everyone learned Latin by reading Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War. I mentioned Caesar's writings about the Gauls when I talked in more general terms about the classical view of the Celts, because Caesar relied heavily on the work of earlier authors who wrote about the Celts, such as Posidonius. This is actually rather surprising in a sense, because you would have thought that since Caesar fought the Gauls and presumably spent a reasonable amount of time in their company, he wouldn't need to use other people's writings about them, but he did. And as a result, we don't really learn much that is new about Celtic customs from Caesar. But we do learn a great deal about the wars that Caesar fought against the Gauls, even if we have to perhaps allow for a little bit of self-serving exaggeration on Caesar's part. And we have another reason to thank Caesar. He is so famous that anything associated with him is immediately glamorous. So some of the earliest archaeological digs in France in the late 19th century were designed to identify Caesar's battlefields. The French public wanted to find the traces of Caesar, and this effort ended up producing a lot of great information about the Gaulish period generally, quite apart from Caesar himself. So let's get down to our story. It's the middle of the 1st century BC. The Celtic-speaking tribes in Gaul have consolidated themselves into several major coalitions. Caesar tells us that all Gaul was divided into 3 parts. Roughly speaking, they are Aquitania in the southwest, which is where we get the later name Aquitaine from, Belgica in the north, the origin of our word Belgium, and Celtica, which is essentially now central and southeastern France. The main events that touched off the conquest happened in the Celtica region. In many ways, the Roman conquest of Gaul was really kind of an accident, and it involved serious political rivalries within the ruling elites of both Rome and Gaul. Here's how it went down. 2 of the most important tribal groupings in Celtica were the Sequani, who lived on the western bank of the Rhine, and the Aedui, who lived just to the west of them in what is now central France. In 71 BC, the Sequani and the Aedui got involved in a quarrel. We're not sure what it was about. The Sequani needed some help, and they decided to call in their neighbors from the eastern bank of the Rhine, a Germanic tribe called the Suebi, led by a chieftain called Ariovistus. The problem was, once the Suebi arrived on the scene, they didn't want to go home. After they defeated the Aedui, they stuck around and began exacting tribute from the Celtic tribes in the vicinity. The Aedui decided to look for allies of their own, and the most powerful people they could think of to call on were the Romans. So in 60 BC, the chieftain of the Aedui, a man named Dividiacus, appealed to Rome for help against the Germans. You would have thought the whole experience with the Germans would have taught him not to do this, but oh well. Lest we think the Gauls were barbarians without any appreciation of the Roman world, we should keep in mind that when Dividiacus visited Rome, he was the guest of Cicero's younger brother, and Cicero himself mentions Dividiacus in his letters. Dividiacus addressed the Roman Senate to ask for an alliance. He returned to Gaul with some sort of vague promise of Roman help, and Cicero certainly backed the idea of an alliance with the Aedui. But Roman politics did not break in a way that favored the Gauls. Cicero's most dangerous political opponent was Julius Caesar, a rising star who became consul in 59 BC. Whatever Cicero favored, Julius Caesar was bound to oppose. He decided that instead of backing an alliance with the Aedui under Dividiacus, Rome should make an alliance with the Germans under Ariovistus. The fact that Julius Caesar was on the German side just made the Suebi even bolder, and they made even more inroads into Celtic territory. By this point, the various tribes of Gaul were split internally over whether it made sense to accommodate themselves to outside domination, whether by Romans or by Germans. This was the perpetual dilemma faced by everyone the Romans came into contact with. Many tribal leaders, like Dividiacus of the Aedui, thought this was the best bet they had. But the younger brother of Dividiacus, a man called Dumnorix, thought that cozying up to the Romans was getting them nowhere. He put out feelers to his father-in-law, Orgetorix, the chieftain of the Helvetii, who were a large Celtic tribe that occupies the territory now known as Switzerland. In fact, the official name of Switzerland is the Confederatio Helvetica, or the Helvetian Confederation, a nod to the Helvetii. Orgetorix also made an alliance with the disaffected son of the chieftain of the Sequani, a man named Casticos. The idea of this alliance was to bring together all the Celts in one united federation to resist encroachment by either the Germans or the Romans. But let's leave these conspirators aside for a moment and look at what was going on in Roman politics, because it would have a huge impact on the future of Gaul. In 60 BC, Julius Caesar had entered into a pact with 2 other powerful Roman political figures, Pompey the Great and Crassus. This alliance is known now as the First Triumvirate. The alliance was not founded on mutual respect, however, but on the recognition that none of the 3 was yet powerful enough to do in the others. The 3 men basically carved up the Roman Empire into spheres of influence. Caesar got the provinces of Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Gallia Narbonensis, which was another name for the province or Provence. These were not the richest parts of the empire. Pompey and Crassus got those. If Caesar was going to make a profit, both economically and politically, he was going to need to expand the territory under his command. Where was Caesar going to expand into? Gaul. And in 58 BC, Caesar got the perfect excuse. When the Celtic world suddenly became even more unstable than usual, several Germanic tribes began moving into the territory of the Helvetii from the north and the northeast. And the Helvetii decided to move west to get out of their way. By this point, their chieftain Orgetorix had died. This migration seems to have been carefully orchestrated in advance. It was not a panicked flight, rather it was an orderly mass movement made possible by the alliance I mentioned earlier between Dumnorix of the Aedui and Casticos of the Sequani. The Helvetii made arrangements with both men to let them pass through their respective territories so that they could settle to their west in Gaul. But we need to keep in mind that Dumnorix and Casticos were not calling the shots for the Aedui and the Sequani. Remember that the chieftain of the Aedui, Dividiacus, was pro-Roman. He had made a speech to the Senate to ask for a Roman alliance. Despite the fact that Julius Caesar had not been interested in a Roman alliance with the Aedui a few years earlier, Dividiacus was willing to give it another shot. He sent word to Caesar that the Helvetii were on the move. Caesar was eager to demonstrate to the other two members of the triumvirate, as well as to the Roman population at large, that he was fully capable of protecting his province of Gallia Narbonensis from these migrating Gauls. So Caesar marched north to meet the Helvetii. They turned northwest into the territory of the Aedui, and Caesar followed. The arrival of Caesar blew open the tensions among the Aedui between pro-Roman and anti-Roman factions. Many of the Aedui were giving aid to the Helvetii. Caesar demanded that they cease and desist, and he probably called for the capture and elimination of Dividiacus's anti-Roman brother, Dumnorix. But Dividiacus did not give his brother up. He apparently told Caesar, through an interpreter, that it would be politically dangerous for him to do so, and that he would lose standing, not just among his own people, but throughout Gaul. This is a sign that anti-Roman sentiment in Gaul was growing across tribal boundaries. Despite the failure of Dividiacus to cooperate, Caesar went after the Helvetii and caught them. In a series of battles, he massacred huge numbers. Of the 400,000 members of the Helvetii who began their migration, only a quarter survived, and these survivors were forced to go back to their homeland, where they were eventually overrun by incoming German tribes, and their language died out. Caesar's demonstration of ruthlessness led some of the other tribes in Gaul to decide that making peace with Caesar was by far the best option, and they figured that if they did so, Caesar might help them against Ariovistus and his Germans. Caesar challenged Ariovistus, who defied him. Ariovistus began gathering his forces in the territory of the Sequani, who were anti-Roman Celts. Caesar then went after Ariovistus and destroyed his army, which meant there was now nobody else for the Romans to compete against in Gaul. The following year, 57 BC, Caesar moved north to campaign against the Belgae, who were the least Romanized of the Gauls. He carried out a brutal campaign of sieges and slaughter. The year after that, Caesar conquered the Veneti, a seafaring people who lived on the Armorican Peninsula in what is now Brittany. He then defeated another attempted German incursion into Gaul. Caesar reports himself that of 430,000 members of the tribes, only a few survived. And when he finished with the Germans, Caesar undertook 2 extended raids into the island of Britain in 55 and 54 BC. It's actually better to call them raids than invasions because it's not clear that Caesar was really prepared to stay for very long. I'll talk more about Caesar and Britain in a future lecture. The main theater was clearly Gaul, and there Caesar had been spectacularly successful. However, a major revolt in 54 to 52 BC nearly undid Caesar's accomplishments. In 54 BC, the political winds shifted throughout Gaul in favor of the anti-Roman party, and almost the whole of Gaul rose in rebellion, led by a chieftain of the Treveri tribe, a man named Indutiomaros. Caesar's response was to put a price on Indutiomaros's head. Indutiomaros was ambushed and killed by a Gaulish traitor. After several other brutal campaigns in 53 BC, Caesar re-established control sufficiently to withdraw from Gaul for the winter. But the Gauls were not yet cowed. Caesar found a worthy opponent in a man named Vercingetorix, who was named the chieftain of the Arverni tribe in 52 BC. The Arverni controlled the territory in south-central France, near what is now Clermont-Ferrand. As soon as Vercingetorix took power, he set about creating an alliance to resist Roman rule. He went up against Caesar at the Battle of Gergovia, the chief oppidum of the Arverni, and he actually defeated Caesar, one of the only times Caesar was ever defeated in battle. This victory obviously put heart into the Gaulish resistance, but ultimately Caesar prevailed. The last stand of Vercingetorix was very dramatic. He holed up in the fortress of Alesia near Dijon in north-central France. Caesar decided to besiege him in Alesia. But sieges could be very dangerous because you're always vulnerable to a counter-siege. While you are surrounding someone inside a city, someone else can come along and surround you. So Vercingetorix called on his Gaulish allies to do just that, to come and surround Caesar. But Caesar knew just what to do. He built a fortress of his own, facing out towards the armies that might come to relieve Alesia. Although the Gaulish allies who arrived to help were not as numerous as Vercingetorix might have hoped, they were still able to spot a weakness in Caesar's fortifications, and when the Gaulish allies on the outside combined with Vercingetorix's forces on the inside, they nearly squeezed Caesar between them and defeated him. But then Caesar personally took command of the very last reserves he had available to them, and he saved the day. Of course, we should keep in mind that we know all of this from Caesar's own pen. It's possible that he is making these events sound a bit more dramatic than they actually were. The end of the story of Vercingetorix is really rather tragic. A much later tradition in the Lives of Plutarch reports that Vercingetorix surrendered in a rather flamboyant fashion. He rode his horse out of the fortress of Alesia and around Caesar's camp before pulling up in front of Caesar, dismounting, and stripping himself of all of his military accoutrement. He then stayed absolutely still until he was taken away. It's worth stating that Caesar himself does not report this story. Now, Caesar was obviously an eyewitness, and he was writing much closer in time to these events, but he also had an incentive to make himself look good and Vercingetorix look bad. So we just have to decide which account to believe, or neither. There is no debate about what happened next. Vercingetorix was taken off to captivity in Rome until it was finally time for Caesar's triumph to be celebrated, 5 years later. A Roman triumph is an extremely grand ceremony that commemorates a splendid military achievement, and it involves a huge parade of the spoils of war, including prominent captives. So Vercingetorix was paraded through the streets of Rome, where he presumably had to put up with the jeers and other abuse of the crowd, and then returned to his prison, where he was probably strangled, as was the custom with the defeated enemies of the Romans. Thus ended the last major rebel against Roman rule in Gaul. So what were the consequences of Caesar's victories over the Gauls for Celtic culture in Gaul? We know that Roman culture quickly became widespread throughout Gaul, at least in the areas that were within easy distance of Roman settlements, and also all along the Roman road network. There, the Latin language came into very wide use, and all the trappings of Roman civilization followed the legions, including characteristic forms of Roman architecture and urban planning, such as aqueducts and amphitheaters. But we have evidence also that the Gaulish language persisted. The evidence comes from a remarkable artifact known as the Coligny calendar, which was made in the 2nd century AD. It's really a kind of perpetual calendar made out of a bronze tablet. This is how it worked. The bronze tablet was divided into 16 columns, and there was a hole in each day for the insertion of a peg to show the current day of the month. The labels on the calendar are in the Gaulish language, but in the Roman alphabet. The existence of this calendar is evidence of the survival not just of the Gaulish language, but also of this very important aspect of Gaulish culture, the reckoning of time. Ultimately, of course, Gaulish did fade away, but it left some important traces in the French language that is descended from the Latin that replaced it. Here are just a few examples. The French verb aller, to go, is descended from a Gaulish word, as is the word for lark, alouette, as in the famous children's song, Alouette, gentille alouette. Carrying on with the bird theme, the French word bec for beak is also Gaulish, and that is, of course, where our word beak comes from as well, via the French spoken in England by the Norman conquerors. The French word for horse, cheval, is Gaulish in origin, as is the word petit, or little. Many of these Gaulish words refer to features of the natural landscape, such as the names of trees, like fir or maple, or kinds of settings, like scrubland, or a copse, or a sandy beach. One can easily imagine the Roman conquerors of Gaul asking the local names for these things and incorporating them into their speech, where they remained and preserved for us the legacy of the ancient Gauls. It had been very hard fought, but the Gauls were now firmly under Roman rule. The last remaining areas of Celtic speech outside of the Roman Empire were Britain and Ireland. We will look in detail at the Roman encounter with Celtic Britain shortly, but in the next lecture, we'll pause to talk about the religion of the Celts.